Wereshmuck. My life is a constant process of realizing what a schmuck I was up until about a month and a half ago. Then I transform, I grow, I turn into something new. I realize still a schmuck right up until that last transformation. It's an ongoing process, a work in progress. Tonight's program is a series of stories, each revolving around one of those crucial moments of transformation for me, those moments that brought me from where I began to pretty much where I am now. In about 1969, my family moved from Hartford, Connecticut to a small town in upstate New York called Schuylerville. We drove all night long in a huge pink Plymouth, a vehicle from which, in time of emergency, smaller vehicles could easily be launched. On the way into town, I was only 5 years old, but my reading skills were already strong enough that I could make out the sign by the first dawn light that said, "Welcome to Schuylerville, population 942. To give you a sense of what kind of a town this was, that afternoon it was the old white-haired mayor himself who drove out to the sign with a bucket o' paint and amended it to say, "and some Jews." I played Little League in Schuylerville, sort of. I attended Little League. I was relegated permanently to a position called deep left field, a position created specifically for me. I was approximately 30 yards behind the left fielder, where I would stand in the deep weeds praying that no ball should ever come to me. My parents saw fit to come watch a game. My parents were not like other parents in Schuylerville. My father got caught up in the moment and wanted to shout support to me from the stands, coach me like the other parents were doing. But he did not have in his vocabulary phrases like "get in the game" or "keep your eye on the ball." So I stood there in the deep weeds in deep left field and heard my father's voice wafting out over the green. "Dylan, leap into the present moment." Throughout my childhood in Schuylerville, I had this recurring nightmare in which I was chased through the woods by angry Christians intent on doing me harm, which incidentally I traced to a particular incident in 1972 when a group of angry Christians chased me through the woods intent on doing me harm. Coming home from school crying after having been brutally beaten, I got home in tears, miserable, and I asked my father, "Why do they hate me so much?" And he said, "Dylan, they don't hate you. They envy you. They are jealous of you, of your intelligence, of your ready wit, your ability to make your teachers laugh, your good grades, your nonviolent relationship with your parents." He did not explain to me that it would not help to explain this to the bullies. Some of his advice, though, was pretty good. I finally worked up the courage to say to him, "I don't like Little League. I've been doing it for 4 years. And I loathe every moment of it. I detest the practices. I detest the games. I'm not that fond of the others on my team." And he said, "Dylan, last month I went to New York and I saw Harold Clurman speak to a group of young playwrights and directors and actors, and one of them raised his hand and asked Harold Clurman, 'Mr. Clurman, what should I do? I've been doing this for 10 years and it just hurts all the time. All the rejection, all these people telling me I'm not good looking enough, I'm not tall enough, I'm not right for the role. It hurts. What should I do?' And Harold Clurman said, I went into my doctor, I said, 'It hurts when I do this.' He said, 'Don't do this.' And at 9, I stared at my father, baffled by the allegory. And he said, 'It's an old doctor joke, Dylan. You can quit Little League.' It was a revelation. The idea broke on me like that first thunderclap after a long, hot, muggy spell. The idea that I could determine my own fate, make my own decision, say, "I do not want to do this anymore if it hurts," was astounding to me. I realized that right up until then, I had sort of been a schmuck. My parents did what they could to raise me to be a good adult. They taught me to trust my instincts, to make decisions for myself. They taught me that it was okay to cry. Sometimes I think it would have been nice if just once they had told me that I would have to be strong, or even that I could. The summer camp that I attended every year through most of my childhood had an arrangement with a nearby Indian reservation. Campers could go and spend a week on the reservation and get a little taste of Native American culture and history, and then return to the summer camp. My third year there, I went to the reservation for a week and did not want to leave. Phone calls were placed, I suspect checks were cut, and an arrangement was made so that I could stay on the reservation for the remainder of the summer. Once a week, a big bonfire was built, and the entire tribe would sit around this fire, and we would get news that was important to the tribe, and we would hear stories. And then the shaman, who was named He Guards the Village, I assume he had a more Americanized name, but I never really learned what it was. He would take up a handful of eagle feathers and walk slowly around the circle. And he would hand feathers to those young men and women who, it had been decided by the elders, were now old enough to really become active members in the community. And each of these young people would get a feather, and the shaman would whisper to each one his or her new name, his adult name, the medicine name. And then once all the feathers were distributed, He Guards the Village would step back, would announce to the tribe what each new member's name was, explain why this name had been chosen for this person, and explain to each of these people that they should never speak their name aloud, because to do so is to call your guardian spirit to help you. Others may call you by it, but to speak your own name aloud is a very sacred and important and powerful thing and is not to be done lightly. My 6th week there, I was sitting next to a young man about my age, and I could feel his tension and excitement. Every week there was this palpable energy, kids waiting to find out if they were grown-ups. And as he approached the two of us, the shaman slowed down and handed me a feather and whispered to me my new name. And I felt honored and excited and frightened and very, very grown up. And he gave us our lecture about what the names meant and how I was not to speak my name aloud, and then told us all that we were to gather in his backyard the following morning for a vision quest. A young man named Michael Running Horse met us in the backyard, gave us a light breakfast of fruit and peyote. This is the worst tasting substance known to man. And once we had pretty much all thrown up, he led us out of the reservation to the base of a nearby mountain, where we took a breather and drank some water and then headed up the slope. Around midday, we reached a narrow cliff, and Michael walked out ahead of us, and we followed him with just sheer rock rising up to our left, and to our right, just an endless ocean of green, of forest, of trees and brush, and it seemed to just go on all the way to the horizon. And I was awed by this sight as we walked out on this narrow ledge and then stopped. And Michael turned and looked out to the west, and we all sort of stood there for what seemed an inordinately long time until a young woman to my right leaned forward and said, "Michael, what are we doing?" And he said, "Now we watch the sunset." It couldn't have been much afternoon. It was going to take a long-ass time to watch the sunset. So we stood facing west, looking out over the world of green. I was 11 years old. I was the only Caucasian there. I was 1.5 miles above the ground, and I was tripping. The green forest seemed to glow with its own inner light. I could feel the trees feeding me oxygen. I could feel them taking up my spent breath. I was so alive. I knew up until this moment I had really just been a schmuck. I stood there looking out at the forest floor in awe of what I was seeing, contemplating my name, and around what movie makers call the golden hour, as the sun was getting down toward but not yet really behind the horizon, an eagle came around the mountain, circled around right in front of us, right out there, so close it felt like we should be able to touch it, but we couldn't. And I imagined what it must be like to see through an eagle's eyes, to look down on this world. And in that instant, bam, I was looking through the eagle's eyes at the world below with a sharper clarity than I could imagine having on my own. I could feel the wind underneath my feathers. I could feel the strength of my talons, and a flicker of movement caught the corner of my perception. And I looked down and saw the raccoon and felt very, very hungry. And the moment I saw it, I looked up through its eyes and knew I had been spotted and knew I was in deep, deep trouble. I saw the eagle plummeting toward me. I felt the power of my wings. I felt my own fingers gripping the rock behind me. I felt my talons drive into the back of the raccoon. I felt the talons drive into my back, lift me into the air, shake me once. And I stood on the cliff, watching the eagle make a long, slow victory circle with the raccoon in its grasp before it disappeared around the mountain again. And I knew I had shared this experience with all the other people on the cliff. We had all been here for it. The eagle had done this for our benefit. And I had been both the consumer and the consumed. I had been the predator and the prey. I was in my place in the world, knowing who and what I was for the first time ever. And then the sun was gone. The following morning, Michael woke me up and said, the shaman would like to see you in his house. This had never happened to me before, so I got up and I went to the shaman's house. I went into his kitchen where he was drinking coffee and eating Captain Crunch. And I sat down. And he said, Dylan, I've been thinking about your vision quest. And I said, so have I. And he nodded slowly like a good therapist. And he said, well, what have you been thinking? And I said, well, I've been thinking that there's no possible way that I can explain what I experienced yesterday to the kids at home when I get back to school. And I don't think I should even bother to try, because there is no possible way that I could make them understand what this experience was. And I think I should really thank you for letting me do this thing. And he said, And finally I said, what have you been thinking? And he said, I've been thinking, maybe you shouldn't tell your parents we gave you peyote. If it does not make you too uncomfortable to do so, please close your eyes, and as I speak each line of the following, find the way in which it is true for you. I have been a rock in a long, winding road. I have been a patch of moss on a granite cliff. I have been a worm burrowing in the warm earth. I have been the warm earth through which the worm burrows. I have been a hawk on a high hill, digging its talons in the soft ground. I am flesh and spirit. I am bone and intellect. I am the God who kindles fire in the head. I will be a tree, reaching toward the sky, growing toward the light. Open your eyes. So I was raised Jewish. I was given a medicine name. I'm a practicing Druid and a studying Taoist. And I like astrophysics a lot. I think of myself as sort of a Zen pagan with a yen for Sagan. All of this drives my father-in-law crazy. He is a Southern Baptist minister who 2 weeks before my wedding sent a lengthy letter to my bride advising her not to marry me, as we would be on unequal footing and therefore could not spend eternity together. This was not all that upsetting to me because, quite frankly, I was already a little intimidated by that whole till death do us part deal. In retaliation, by the way, the night before our wedding, I took him out to dinner and spent the entire meal insistently talking about Jesus stuff and getting it wrong. I told him I had always admired Jesus for his immortality and his ability to turn into a bat when threatened. And he said, no, Dylan, that's Dracula. And but there was something about drinking blood in there, wasn't there? I was watching just the vein in his forehead throb. I told him I particularly like that part of the story where he sodomized the money launderers. And he said, no, not money. They were money lenders. Whatever. He turned them over their tables. It was good for everyone. No! Be that as it may. I am a practicing Druid. There's a small park near my home with a grove that I have sanctified for my own odd ritual purposes. I go there late at night now and again. A few years ago, on Halloween, it occurred to me that as this is a fairly important pagan holiday, I ought to do something. So as we neared midnight, I drove to my grove, found a space for my car across the street, and got out to cross the street. I was approached by a homeless man with a big bag of candy and a ghost mask pushed up on his head. Because Halloween is the one night of the year in America when a homeless guy can feel like a participant instead of a pest. He gave me a big thumbs up and smiled, and I smiled and gave him a big thumbs up and started to cross the street toward my sacred grove and was aware of this homeless guy crossing the street behind me and to my right, and it made me a little nervous. I reminded myself, this is my sacred space. Nothing can hurt me here. I am safe. I entered my grove. The homeless guy entered my grove. He sat down at the base of a tree to eat his dinner there. I shrugged and started moving around my grove, greeting each of the trees, which is what I do. I sort of touch them. I say hello. I thank them for absorbing my spent air and providing me with oxygen. We have a little moment. I ask them if they have any important wisdom for me. They pretty much just stand there and tolerate me. And then eventually I'm done and I go home. So I was moving around from tree to tree, and I was standing with my hands at the trunk of a tree. A group of 5 or 6 young Hispanic men, 15 or 16 years old, came into the park carrying long-necked bottles of beer and speaking fast Spanish and drinking. And I knew, demographically speaking, these are the people I am most supposed to fear as a middle-class white guy in a park near midnight. I reminded myself that this was my sacred space. Nothing could hurt me here. I was completely safe. The young Hispanic men took up a position about 5 or 6 feet away from me, totally unaware that I was standing next to the tree wrapped in shadow. And they were speaking Spanish. I was starting to feel like a spy, although I don't speak Spanish, so I felt like a bad spy. But I didn't want to be eavesdropping, whether I understood them or not, so I stepped away from the tree and I said, "Excuse me," and they went, "Ah!" And I said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you. I'm a Druid. I'm using this grove just now. Could you come back in 10 or 15 minutes when I'm through?" And they spoke some fast Spanish, and They fanned out into sort of a loose semicircle around me, and one of them took up a position of leadership and stepped forward and said in a tone that may or may not have been vaguely threatening, "Excuse me?" And at this moment, I had a vivid and detailed memory of the world's stupidest mugging, of which I had been a victim some 14 years earlier. I was 21 years old, living in New York. It was January, and I was much farther north on the island of Manhattan than any middle-class white guy has any right to be as it is approaching midnight. I was sitting at a bus stop, waiting for the bus to come. My breath was steaming in the winter air. And a large African-American man, well, it was the mid-'80s, so he was still just a big black guy, came and sat down next to me. And we sat there next to each other with our breaths steaming in the night air. And after a few minutes, he said, "Give me all your money." And I said, "What?" And he said, "I'm mugging you. Give me all your money." And I said, "Well, do you have a knife or something?" And he said, I could go upstairs and get a knife if you want. I did not want that. So I gave him my money. I had $6 in my pocket that I gave to this man. And we sat there on the bus bench with our breath steaming in the night air, till finally I said, "Well, now I can't get on the bus." And he said, "Oh, here." And he gave back $1, which was at the time the cost of a bus ride in Manhattan. And I said, "Thanks," to my mugger. And we sat there with our breath steaming in the night air until eventually the bus came. And I got up to get on the bus, and he was getting on right behind me and to my right. And I thought about saying to the bus driver, "Hey, this guy just mugged me." But at this point, it was $5. So it felt less like reporting a crime than like telling on a guy. So I got on the bus, and I found a seat, and I sat down, and my mugger got on the bus and found a seat behind me and sat down. And we rode on southward about 4 or 5 blocks before he tapped me on the shoulder and handed me $2. Said, "Here, you always ought to have some cash on you." And I again said, "Thank you," to my mugger. And he went and sat down. And we rode on downtown until eventually he rang to get off the bus. And as the bus was pulling to a stop, he stopped by my seat and said, "You know, I really just needed bus fare. Why don't you take the rest of this money back?" But by now I felt like I had bonded with my mugger. So I said, "Why don't you hang on to that? You really always ought to have some cash on you." And my mugger said, "Hey, thanks," and got off the bus. Now all of this flashed through my mind as I was standing in my grove with the moonlight trickling down through the leaves, and these young Hispanic men were fanned out around me, and one of them was sort of taller than I was, and he said, "Excuse me, what did you just say?" And before I could formulate a response, the homeless guy stood up behind them and said, "He said," and they all went, "Oh, Jesus." He said, "We're Druids, and we're using this grove right now. Could you come back in 10 or 15 minutes when we're done?" And they all spoke fast Spanish to each other, and their leader turned toward me and said, "So, 10 after 12? And I said, "Yeah, that'd be great." And he said, "Okay, thanks." And they turned to move off through the park, and I gave the homeless guy a big thumbs up and a smile, and he gave me a thumbs up and a smile, and he sat down to finish his dinner by the tree, and I turned to thank my tree for giving me this place of safety where nothing could harm me and everything was sacred. And I put my hands against the tree, and at this point I saw one of the young men turned back to look at us. And I smiled and I nodded, but apparently the shadows had swallowed me up again. Because I heard him say to his friends, "Yo, dudes, where did they go? And how many do you think there were? And do you think they can really turn into bats?" A poem for my grandfather. It's called Grandpa Remembered. He spoke of shtetls from his memory, of honey-sucking days that climbed straw-shingled shacks, of shocking Cossack Saturdays and bloodshot Sundays, sobbing, swabbing red-stained stones. He spoke to me of synagogues, of dovening old men, of smells that dovetailed into peaceful smiles in winter's hearth remembrance. The images awakened. Stirred, they spurred him on beyond my scolded bedtime, lap-snuggled, listening. His history, deep-voiced with warnings wrapped in chuckles and cautionary anecdotes, through humor's lens made horror under laughing glass. And Grandpa's rocking rhythm, tinged with pipe smoke, still resides in me and ever will, entwined with telling tales of far ago he wove against forgetting. I adored my grandfather. I've mentioned that I was raised Jewish. Not entirely true. I was raised by Jews. My parents tried to raise me with a sense of history and tradition, both me and my sister. But they were lapsed Jews themselves and didn't know what they were doing. So, every year they wanted to do Hanukkah, but they never really knew what day it started. So we always wound up burning extra candles, trying to make up lost time. They didn't actually know the Hebrew, so every year my dad was making it up. He'd be lighting the candles going, abracadabra, alakazam, we light the candles, we don't eat ham. I once pressed him for an explanation of the holiday. He went the traditional self-loathing, self-deprecating route that is so common to Jews. He said, "Dylan, Hanukkah is a celebration of the fact that many, many centuries ago, some of our people got a really good deal on some lamp oil." And then he sort of shrugged like he was forgiving himself for a faux pas committed against some college friend whose name is only half remembered, and let it go. My mother did actually believe in some kind of Caucasian, bearded, Judeo-Christian deity of some kind. My dad's only deity was Harold Clurman, the Broadway director, to whom he would attribute any thought or witticism that he felt would sound better coming as a quotation. I'd be beaten up on the way home from school, and he would say, "Well, as Harold Clurman would say, Dylan, the hell of it is, they have their reasons." You can see how that's really much more useful to a small child coming from a Broadway director. Now, when I was 14, I left home for prep school. I went to a prep school in Western Massachusetts. It had originally been two separate schools, one all-male, one all-female. By the time I got there, it was two co-ed campuses separated by about 5 miles of deep, deep country road. I used to torment the teachers by calling them campi. I was clever. Oh, wait, no. I was a schmuck. Despite the fact that I was away now at school, we maintained a family tradition. Every Thanksgiving, we would go to Lakewood, New Jersey, and spend the time with my grandparents. From the time I was 13 until several years later when he died, after Thanksgiving dinner, my grandfather and I would retire to his den and smoke pot and watch football with the sound turned down and classical music on the radio. He smoked pot to relieve nausea caused by medication he was on. I smoked for a slew of other reasons. It was really good bonding time. I am, to this day, the only person I know who, on his grandfather's death, inherited $500 and a bong. My sophomore year at Northfield Mount Hermon, the prep school from which I later failed to graduate, we had Thanksgiving dinner. My grandfather and I went into his den. We began to get high. He did not turn on the football game. He asked me if I had found a card game yet. I was sort of shocked. I had no idea that my family had a history of making money playing cards. And I hadn't told anyone that I'd started playing cards. I had found a game my second week at the school. It was a poker game in the dorm where I lived, and I had been losing $2 to $4 every week. He asked me if I was winning. I lied and said, sometimes. And he said, don't bullshit me, Dylan. People either lose at poker or they know how to play. And he produced a deck of cards and handled it like a Vegas mechanic. Started dealing open hands as he taught me poker. He explained to me that poker is not a game of luck, it's a game of psychology and skill. He explained to me that it's not about who has the better cards, it's about who walks away with the money. He taught me how to tell what the other person has by the way he bets and how to hide what I have through the way I bet. And after about an hour of this, he set the cards aside and said, Dylan, would you feel comfortable wearing a yarmulke at that school of yours? I told him that I would not. I told him that it seemed to me that wearing a yarmulke on these mostly Christian campi, yes, he chuckled. If anyone still hasn't gotten it, feel free to copy off of him later on. I said that yes, it would make me very uncomfortable. I'd prefer not to wear a yarmulke. It would be like wearing a Star of David pinned to my shirt. He did not take offense. He explained to me that the purpose of the yarmulke is not to identify us as Jews. It is to hide our identity from above. He said that according to the Jewish tradition, if your identity is completely hidden from above by the yarmulke, then God can't tell the difference between us and we will all be treated equally. I pointed out to him that some people embroider their names in the yarmulke. Again, he took no offense. He said, all right, Dylan, how would you feel about it if we just bought you some nice sort of hat that you liked and you could wear that? It was clearly important to him, so I let him take me to a hat store. In Lakewood, New Jersey, there is a store filled with hats that no human being could wear unselfconsciously. And I stood in this store sort of aghast and appalled and unhappy. And finally I picked out a Greek fisherman's cap. It was fairly simple, and it was on sale. And I figured, what could it hurt? And I let him buy it for me. And he paid for the hat, and he put it on me, and he gave me a wink that will forever be the wink of Santa Claus in the Night Before Christmas poem. And he sent me back off home with my new hat, and I wore it proudly. It was a personal identity hat. I wore it around the campuses. People knew who I was from across a field. Hey, do you know Dylan? Who? The guy with the hat. Oh, yeah. That was me. I was the guy with the hat. I had an identity. I was very, very happy. One night, I got trapped on the wrong campus. I missed the bus back to where I lived and had to eat dinner in a dining hall that was unfamiliar to me. I had never been questioned about the hat before, so I walked into the dining hall without thinking twice, without thinking once. I loaded up an industrial-strength blue plastic tray with chicken bits and tater tots and went and sat down and started eating. And an 8-foot-tall man appeared behind me and to my right and said in a voice that should surely belong to a talking walrus in a cartoon, "Who do you think you are, and where do you think you are?" I was already a fairly witty, clever guy, so I said, "What?" He said, "You do not say what to me. You say, 'Excuse me, sir,' or 'I beg your pardon, sir.'" I don't know if I was truly baffled or if I was just a smartass. I said, "What?" He grabbed me by the arm, a grip that I remember every time now I have my blood pressure taken. He lifted me out of the chair, knocking it over, shouted to someone to pick it up, snatched the hat off my head, and pushed me toward the door, saying, "I don't know where you come from, but here in polite society, we do not wear hats in the dining hall." And he pushed me out, and he threw the hat after me. And I was 15 and humiliated. I picked up the hat, and I kissed it, and I put it on. And instead of waiting for a bus, I walked the 5 miles back to my campus with tears streaming, cursing my grandfather for making me wear the hat, cursing myself for refusing to wear a yarmulke, which surely he would not have torn from my head. And I got back to my room in my dorm, where my roommate was wearing boot-cut jeans over sneakers and a button-down plaid shirt over a blue t-shirt, and typing at my old, loud, manual Olympic portable typewriter. And he said, "What's the matter?" And I said, "I was eating dinner on the other campus, and the stranger came up and he took my hat, he threw my hat on the ground." And my roommate said, "So?" And rather than explaining the significance, I lied and said, "Do you know how expensive this hat is?" And he said, "Is that all you people think about?" For weeks, the hat was all I could think about. Had I chosen it because it was the cheapest one in the store and on sale? Had I been thinking like a people? I began losing deliberately at poker. All of this hung with me as a point of sadness because as an adolescent, I had no way of understanding the complex conflicts involved. My grandfather's religious paraphernalia against prep school traditions, a teacher's need for authority against a 15-year-old's need for identity. It was all way too complicated for me to see until 3 years ago. I went back to that prep school as an artist in residence. Apparently, when you get your first book published, they rescind your persona non grata status and have you back as a role model. I walked into that dining hall, and the whole event flooded back to me in a bizarre mix of perspective and analysis and emotion and intellect. And I realized the hell of it is, he had his reasons. And layer upon layer of darkness peeled away like veils from an Eastern dancer until the truth of that moment was turning before me in perfect grace and proper time. And somewhere in the back of my head, I heard Harold Clurman say, "Ha! Let there be light." At that prep school in 1978, I smoked marijuana for the first time, and then continued to smoke until spring of 1997. I quit in 1997 and am proud to say that I am still firmly in favor of its legalization for industrial, medicinal, and recreational uses. I was afraid for a time that my politics would change with that change in my lifestyle. For 2 months after I quit smoking pot, I had this recurring nightmare where I was hanging out with Charlton Heston and we were kind of getting along. I was particularly offended by the anti-educational propaganda-based Just Say No campaign. I had the much simpler motto, just say no your limits. This is the reason, by the way, that I quit. I found myself every afternoon sitting at home watching Sailor Moon, going, I think they shot this scene near my house. It was clearly time to quit. It bothers me that elements of American history have been expunged. I used to do a good deal about this in my act. I used to say in my act that, the way I see it, if I'm not wasted, the day is. And then I was told that Bill Maher, a political comic who some of you may be familiar with, was doing the same joke. So I approached him outside the Improv one night, and I said, Bill, I understand we're doing the same joke. And he said, what's the joke? And I told him. And he said, oh yeah, word for word, that's mine. And I said, well, why isn't it mine? And he said, well, how long have you been doing it? And I said, I started in 1984. And he said, 1983, it's mine. From which I learned a valuable Hollywood lesson, which I now pass on to all of you. Let the other guy bid first. Talking about this, I think, lost me some television jobs over the years. It certainly kept me out of some clubs during Reagan and Bush. I'll live with that. I think the truth is of greater value than anybody's individual career. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of brief history lesson. Up until the late 20s, hemp, the plant from which marijuana comes, was America's #1 cash crop. It made the sails that sailed our ships and the rope that was used to hoist those sails. Cannabis, the medicinal form, was the second most prescribed drug in America, following only what? Aspirin. Hashish, a very potent recreational form of the drug, was used by everyone from the middle class through the upper class. Unfortunately for hemp, in the late 20s, somebody found a way to strip the hemp plant and make paper. And this threatened William Randolph Hearst's lumber holdings. So he began to run stories in his newspapers saying that marijuana was very dangerous. No one had ever heard the word marijuana. It was sort of a dirty-sounding Mexican-ish kind of word. It made people nervous. He told America the truth. He told them that this horrible marijuana stuff was coming up from Mexico and causing Negroes to walk around smiling in public. People began to be uncomfortable with marijuana. He didn't really have the power to do anything about it, though, until somebody else came up with a way of refining hemp seed oil to create fuel and the equivalent of plastic. Now DuPont's crude oil holdings were threatened. And DuPont worked with Hearst to bring a bill to Congress through the House Ways and Means Committee, a group of stodgy old men that really should have been called the Wheeze and Moans Committee. And by taking this roundabout route, they avoided a great deal of publicity, so that by the time the Marijuana Tax Act came up to a vote, it had slipped past all the appropriate scrutiny. And on the day that it came up for a vote, the American Medical Association showed up and said, whoa, 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 you're talking about cannabis? You can't do this. And they were told they should have lodged these complaints much earlier. And the Agriculture Department said, well, you can't do this to hemp. We need hemp. It's important. And they were told they had waited too long to lodge these complaints. And the Marijuana Tax Act went into effect, putting a prohibitive tax on the growing of hemp and making it impossible for people to do so profitably. Over the years that followed, it was outlawed as a dangerous drug, and we wound up in the position we're in now. So in order to protect the two most damaging to our environment industries, it is illegal for me to watch Xeno Warrior Princess and smoke a doobie, which is unfortunate because it's the only way I can enjoy that show. It replenishes oxygen, it grows incredibly fast, it's a renewable resource. When you think about it, an entire nation full of hemp-burning cars sure could make it a lot less stressful to get caught in a traffic jam. Roll down the window, crank up the tunes. Here is something they will not have taught you in grade school. I feel it is important. George Washington wrote in his private journal, and I quote, "I prefer a pipe full of hemp to a glass of wine any day." We're talking about George, the father, the founder, the guy on our money. George talking about hemp, grass, weed, smoke, reefer, check it out, what you want. We're talking about George, the greatest American dreamer of all. George going, this is great. We'll sneak across the river in the fog. You guys, crouched down in the back of the boat. I gotta stand up here with the wind in my wig. This is hot. What was I just gonna say? Talking about George. George Washington, getting desperate late at night, scraping the resin out of those wooden teeth, smoking it, getting headaches. It's important stuff. The founding fathers were hippies. That long hair was no accident. There's a reason our money is green. Do you understand my point? I love that piece. Recently I allowed a friend of mine in the comedy industry to read the script for this show, and she read it, and she said, you know, Dylan, I know you haven't been on the road for a while, but this is kind of hack. There are a lot of comics out there talking about how George Washington smoked dope. On the one hand, it made me sort of sad. It's a good piece. I wrote it a long time ago. I adore it. It's funny. I hate to lose a good piece. I certainly hate to seem like a hack. On the other hand, it means that my efforts toward raising consciousness across the country may have had some little effect, at least in my fellow comics. But the most exciting thing about hearing this was realizing that up until about a month and a half ago, I was a schmuck. Because now, if one of these young comics comes up to me and says, hey, you know, we're both doing that same bit about George Washington, I'm going to say, really? How long you been doing it? All right. This is sort of embarrassing. My last year in college, I went to London and I studied at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts, and I got into the Society of British Fight Directors, and it was the first time I had a sense of myself as a physical entity, as not an entirely non-athletic human. And I thought to express this particular transformation, it would be good. I'd have a partner come in, we'd do a sword fight, it would be exciting, it would be fun, it would be flashy, it would lend action to an otherwise entirely verbal show, but he hasn't shown up. So I would like to do for you now from Romeo and Juliet, the Mercutio-Tybalt sword fight scene. I will play Mercutio and Tybalt. Oh, come, dishonorable, vile submission. Alla staccato carries it away. Tybalt, you rat catcher, will you walk? What wouldst thou have with me? Oh, good king of cats, nothing but one of your 9 lives. That I mean to make bold withal. And as you shall use me hereafter, dry beat the rest of the 8. How about you, sir? Sir, the hurt cannot be much. No! 'Tis not so deep as a well, nor wide as a church door, but 'tis enough. 'Twill serve. By the early 90s, I was doing 20 to 30 weeks a year on the road as a comic. It was really all I had ever wanted to do with my life, and it had really begun to lose its glamour. A lot of hotel rooms, a lot of comics condos with locks on the telephone, because Andy Kindler can't make a fucking collect call. I met the most negative human on the planet. Unfortunately, I didn't figure this out till it was too late. He and I booked a series of gigs together. We were both starting in Vegas on the same weekend. I was opening for Robert Schimmel at Bally's at Catch a Rising Star. He was at the Comedy Stop at the Trop, right up the strip, a horrible club where they actually have a clock face in the floor of the stage because they don't want you going a minute over your time. If you do, they dock your pay. His last show was at midnight on a Saturday. We were to get together, and we got into his Honda CRX. We were going to go up Reno, Park City, Utah, Salt Lake City, Utah for the next weekend, Pocatello, Idaho, and then Northern California, Redding, San Jose, Monterey, and down the coast. I don't know, Santa Barbara, Santa Maria. We were going to wind up down in San Diego at the end of the thing. We left Vegas in his car. He told me for an hour and a half that his girlfriend had just broken up with him before he left LA, that she was the most beautiful woman he had ever met, that he adored her, that he didn't know how he was going to live without her, that he had never felt so alone, he had never felt so afraid, he had never been so depressed. He told me this for an hour and a half, and then he said, "You're single, you might have some ideas on how to handle this, you know, because you're a fairly smart guy, and you seem to be getting along okay." And I said, "Well, I think," and he said, "Hey, did it sound to you like I was finished?" And I began to look ahead at the upcoming 3 weeks with a sort of a dread unlike any I had experienced before. Clubs where they knew me, I would headline, he would middle. At clubs where they knew him, he would headline, I would middle. So depending on the structure of the show, I would speak 30 or 60 minutes a night, and he would speak the rest of the time. We got to a town just outside of San Francisco. I had never seen San Francisco before. I was very excited to go see San Francisco. He wouldn't hear of letting me rent a car. He would go into town with me. So we left in the morning. It took us an hour to get into San Francisco. Our show was at 8 at night. We had the day to spend, and it was beautiful. Saw Haight-Ashbury, played Frisbee with some strangers. I saw the tree from the Janis Joplin photograph, and I sort of looked at it and thought about all the things it must have seen, and I put my hands on it, and I thanked it for accepting my spent air and giving me its oxygen, and asked it if it had any wisdom for me, and it didn't. And then at 4 in the afternoon, with hours to spare before our show, plenty of time to get lost, re-find ourselves, get to the hotel, take a shower, and still get to the show, we left San Francisco. Leaving San Francisco, we crossed a bridge and reached a place where, as we were driving, there was hard rock cliff up to our left. And off to our right, the bay. Crystal and blue and clear, with sailboats dancing and bobbing and leaning in the breezes. And at the top of this cliff to our left, there was a cloud. If you were up there, it would be fog. Just right there, sitting on the edge of the cliff like icing, just starting to drip down, just dripping down over the edge of the cliff. To my right, the beautiful clear sky over the bay. To my left, this slow motion waterfall coming down the cliff. I could see it moving. To my right, no hint of a cloud. To my left, the cliff has disappeared. To my right, the bay is gone. And I was in awe, amazed by the magic of the weather the universe had provided me. And he said, "Great, now we've got fucking fog to contend with!" And at that moment it occurred to me that maybe, just maybe, there was no guarantee that a life in comedy would make me happy. End of 1996, beginning of 1997. Publication of my first book was delayed by 1 month for 7 months in a row. I became steadily more depressed until eventually my wife said, "Dylan, you have to talk to somebody. You are absorbing all the light in the apartment." I went to the Yellow Pages, I found a name, I called the guy, I made an appointment, I wrote down the address. The next day I went to that address and realized I had not written down the name. So I hung around the waiting area until someone said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "I had an appointment with a therapist, and my wife says I have to get help, but I forgot his name, and I don't know what to do." It turned out the man talking to me was a therapist, and he had a free hour. Well, not free. Available. I went and talked to him. Turned out to be a pretty good therapist. He does all the right stuff. He mirrors my body posture, so I think he understands me, and he asks me how things make me feel, all the good therapist stuff that they're supposed to do. And about 3 weeks into this process, I sort of sheepishly said, "I walked past a martial arts studio yesterday. I'm thinking about studying Taekwondo." And he leaned forward and told me very quietly that most depression cases can be cured through 30 or 40 minutes of serious cardiovascular workout 3 or 4 times a week. He said it really quietly, like the other therapists would beat him up in the parking lot for giving away trade secrets. He thought it might not be a bad idea if I went. So I went and signed up. I did a trial week first. My first class, I made it through 12 minutes before I had to throw up. Made it through a little more the next night and a little more the following night, studying under Master Jin Ki Lim, a wonderful Korean master. And at first I had struggles with everything. I wasn't even I was uncomfortable wearing the uniform. I didn't like calling him master, until I saw him jump 14 feet in the air and break a board with his feet. And then I said, I'll dress up in a sailor suit and call you Sheila. Just don't do that to me. My life began to change through this. 5 or 6 months into the process, I took a bad fall attempting a new technique, and I landed on my head, and I crinked my neck up very badly, and it hurt. But by now, I had begun to project upon Master Lim really magical powers. And I believed that if I went to him and said, "I've hurt my neck," he would immediately turn into Pat Morita, slap his hands together, create magical warmth, touch me, and I would be healed. Don't know why I thought that, it had taken him 5 years, he was still struggling with broken English. I went to him and I said, "Master Lim, last week I fell on my head and I hurt my neck, and can you fix it?" And he said, "Oh, really bad, huh?" "Yes, sir, it's very, very bad." "Oh." I said, "Do you have a cure for that?" And he said, "Yeah, lifetime training." I said, "A lifetime of training, sir?" And he said, "Maybe 10, 15 years training." And I said, "Sir, are you saying that if I train for 10 or 15 years, it won't hurt anymore when I fall on my head?" And he said, "No. Then you won't fall on your head." And I said, "Sir, it's an Asian doctor joke." And he said, "Huh?" Because when he's really baffled, he turns into Scooby-Doo. And I said, I went into my doctor, and I said, "Doctor, it hurts when I do this." And he said, "Then don't do this." And Master Lim lit up and said, "Yeah, that's a good doctor. You keep that doctor." Western thinking teaches us not to fall down. Grown-ups don't do that. Eastern thinking teaches us for every time we fall down, we have to get up. If you never fall down, you are not learning to do anything new. If you're never afraid, you are always exploring your known world. If you do not begin a new journey every day, you remain exactly where you are. Are you completely happy where you are? There's an infinite number of reasons to stay with what we know. My teachers failed me. My employers don't respect my skills. My friend betrayed me. My parents failed to give me what I needed, failed to provide for me, neglected the one thing I needed to know. Think of them as challenges, not obstacles. And it's begun. Whether they are shortcomings or limitations, whether they are physical or psychological, in the end, they're all just blocks.